So thanks very much for inviting me here. It's neat to see Google Australia, the place where Google Maps was born. I'm from the paleogeographer side of the geographer family, which is to say I was doing GIS before 2005. And that gives me kind of a shaken by the earthquake view of what Google Maps, and to some extent Google Earth did to our field. Well, actually Google Maps did far more than Google Earth. So anyways, it's my first trip to Australia, and I was really expecting a bit of a culture shock coming from the Northern Hemisphere, so I prepared a few special slides. But it turns out that the equipment is compatible and everything in fact still works as I'd expect. Anyhow, I have a problem which I'd like to share with you, and it's not an uncommon problem. It's probably a problem a few of you share. My problem is I have a mother-in-law. And when we sit down to Christmas dinner, which is coming up, she has this question that she asks. And it's a perfectly reasonable question for a mother-in-law to ask a son-in-law. She asked me, what is it that I do? What do I do for a living? The subtext being, am I doing something that can rationally be expected to help support her perfect daughter and 2 darling grandchildren? And this is where things get difficult, because what I do is I sit in my office at the back of the house and I work on software that people are encouraged to deploy and download and use for free. And she understands the programming part of it well enough, at least insofar as I sit in front of my computer and I type things on it. But the for free part causes serious discomfort, because how do the perfect daughter and the 2 darling grandchildren get supported for free? Why am I confident that I can earn a living in my chosen field when my work product is free? Am I crazy, perhaps? Am I some kind of utopian hippie? Maybe not good son-in-law material, at least. The proximate answer, and this is, on a good night, this is probably enough to cool her off, is that I'm employed by a company, OpenGeo, that pays me to sit and work on the software that we give away for free. Voila. But it doesn't take much to see past that dodge. And by her second glass of wine, she'll come around again. So who pays OpenGeo for this free software? Who indeed? In the competitive marketplace full of beasts like Oracle and Apple and Microsoft, how can something as warm and soft and cuddly and fluffy as an open source company survive? What is it exactly that we are selling? Yeah. Yeah, don't feed the bunny to Balmer. Don't feed the bunny to Balmer. If you want to understand what open source companies are selling, it helps to understand what existing proprietary vendors are selling. And here's a surprising part. They aren't selling software. What they're selling is products. Let me explain what I mean by that. In the business classic, Crossing the Chasm, which I highly recommend, Geoffrey Moore says that in the technology adoption life cycle, which is traditionally understood as a smooth passage from the small early market of visionaries and early adopters to the large mainstream market of pragmatists and conservatives, there's a little understood gap. In fact, a huge chasm between the small early markets and the big mainstream markets. And the chasm is there because the personalities of the customers in the early markets are very different from the personalities of customers in the mainstream market. Early adopters and visionaries have a very high tolerance for risk. They like to learn things themselves. They don't need a lot of support. Here's an early adopter with the iPhone that he bought on the first day they were available. The mainstream customers are exactly the opposite. In order to prosper, growing software companies have to cross the market chasm. And to do so, Geoffrey Moore says they have to transition from selling just software into selling what he calls a whole product. Now, a naive young technology company might say, hey, but we have a product, it's on this CD-ROM right here. But they don't have a product. What they have is software. What they have is sellable in the early markets, but not in the mainstream markets. The whole product has software at its core, but it adds in a critical layer of extra services and infrastructure around the outside. Things that reduce the risk or the perceived risk associated with adopting the product. Training courses, support infrastructure, resellers, consulting networks, update mechanisms, these kinds of things. And it's the combination of the software with the added layer of valuable extras that makes a compelling whole product. Only a whole product can move from the adventurous early adopter market into the risk-averse mainstream market. For example, as an example of a whole product, Oracle. As a piece of database software, Oracle is not all that compelling. It's kind of bulky. It's really hard to learn. It's pretty easy to screw it up even when you have learned it. But when you add in a 300-pound shelf of professionally written documentation, training to build a population of developers and administrators, a rich ecosystem of third-party tools, a reputable, if mercenary, company providing support, an evil genius, and deep integration with the other elements of the Oracle software portfolio, you have a very compelling whole product. Now, here's an odd thing. Even though it's very easy to see that the whole product offers tremendous value above and beyond the software itself, our mental model of technology acquisition is still one where we pay money for the software, and the vendor throws in the rest of the whole product for free. All that great extra value for free. And this is where our cognitive dissonance about open source software companies comes from, because what happens to our mental model when the cost of the software goes to zero? No company can give away the software for free and provide the rest of the whole product for free. Something has to give. Now, for the early adopters and technological visionaries, the people in the early market, and let's be honest, that's basically you kind of people, there's no problem. They just take advantage of the software as is, and they take advantage of the thinner layer of support provided by the open source community for free. They don't need the whole product, and they probably never will. But what about that huge early majority and late majority? What's it going to take to get them to adopt open source software? The low price of the software alone isn't sufficient to seal the deal because the rest of the whole product is missing. So the long-term open source business model, as a general proposition, is about providing a whole product suitable for mainstream customers, but changing the point of monetization. Instead of companies selling software and cross-subsidizing a free network of services for customers, we're going to have customers selling access to a free network of services and cross-subsidizing the development of free software. This is precisely the Red Hat Linux development model. Let's say you've got some open source software being developed on the internet. You've got Red Hat and a risk-averse mainstream customer. He gives Red Hat money for Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Red Hat uses that money to build a whole product and to fund open source software development. They take a copy of the raw software and give it to the customer as a whole product. The customer could simply download the software directly, but then he wouldn't get support, automatic upgrades, testing, and so on. And for a mainstream customer, that feels like a very risky situation to be in. That's how an open source company is supposed to work in the ideal situation. However, it's not like the old proprietary model is just fading away. Microsoft is a $223 billion company, and Oracle is a $103 billion company, and SAP, little SAP, is a $58 billion company. The biggest open source software vendor, Red Hat, is a $5 billion company. So maybe I should be worried. Maybe I should be polishing my resume. Both open source and open source companies sound like fluffy, helpless bunnies, cuddly and fun to play with, but way overmatched in the marketplace. Why am I so confident? I'm confident because there's more to this story than just the market for shrink-wrapped software. And there is a lot more to the fluffy bunny than meets the eye. The fluffy bunny is busy transforming the field of information technology in profound ways, leaving carnage in its wake. For example, The Economist magazine, arbiter of all that is free, good and great in the free market orthodoxy, has already taken in the situation and declared open source software a serious player. Open source software has won the argument. It is now generally accepted that the future will involve both a blend of both proprietary and open source software. How can this be? The leading open source software company has a market capitalization less than 3% of the leading proprietary company. How can open source win the argument if it's so manifestly overmatched? Here's how. First, understand you can't comprehend the success of open source exclusively by looking at the marketplace. In the marketplace, the unit of competition is the company, and the measure of success is profit. The more dollars you take in, the more successful you are, and if you take in too few dollars, you go extinct. That might sound a little familiar. Lots of people have noticed that there's parallels between the market and the field of evolutionary biology. When taken to extreme, you'll get theories like social Darwinism, but for our case, the metaphor is instructive. Only the strong survive. Those companies, organisms that best adapt to their markets, environments, take in the most money, food or energy, and those that do not go extinct, they go bankrupt. Also, as with evolutionary biology, it's easy to be distracted by the lumbering beasts that appear to be the ones directly engaged in competition, and that's a bad thing, because the really important competition is not at the level of the organism, but at a lower level, much farther down in the realm of the gene. The competition between genes is described by Richard Dawkins in his book, The Selfish Gene, which is an exploration of how simple, selfish reproductive behavior at the level of genes can lead to apparently altruistic behaviors at the level of the organism. In Dawkins' formulation, behaviors that maximize the chances of genetic survival are passed to future generations, even when those behaviors endanger the survival of a particular organism. So, for example, here's a behavior that makes no sense in an organism-centric model. This is a killdeer on Vancouver Island, where I live, engaging in a distraction display. The parent bird puts on an elaborate and totally fake display of being injured to draw an approaching predator, or in this case, asshole with video camera, away from its young. The parent organism is placing itself at great risk here. Why? Because the strategy is a good way to preserve the genetic heritage of the children in the nest. Now, The Selfish Gene came out in 1976, and in the opening pages, Dawkins has this to say about some of his contemporaries, and you can see right away where he gets his reputation as a gentle and self-effacing man. The trouble with these other books is that the authors got it totally and utterly wrong. They got it wrong because they misunderstood how evolution works. They made the erroneous assumption that the important thing in evolution is the good of the species or the group rather than the good of the individual or the gene. The same criticism applies to people who attempt to understand the success of open source through an analysis of the marketplace. They misunderstand how software lives and dies, confusing the host with what it carries, because the unit of competition in the world of software is not the corporation, it is the program. It's software, it's code. In the biosphere, organisms feed on other organisms, which feed on plants, which feed on light from Mr. Sun. So in the end, the competition is for sources of energy, either direct in the form of sunlight or stored in the bodies of plants and other animals. In the cybersphere, programs also compete for resources. And the resource that programs compete for is developer time, commonly known as human attention. So programs feed on developers, who in turn feed on caffeinated beverages and try to stay away from Mr. Sun. Programs need programmer attention to survive. A program that is no longer being maintained and updated is a program that is dying. A program that no one has a use for is dead. First it will be abandoned, unrun, then it will become unrunnable, and then it will be deleted. Programs need programmer attention to survive. You don't believe me? When Oracle gobbles up yet another enterprise software company, do the customers bemoan the death of the company? No. Primarily they worry about the software. Will the bugs be fixed? Will that next release come out with the new features? Will the developers leave and flee to greener pastures? Will the new owner continue to feed the software? And what does the software worry about? All that matters to the software is that it continues to receive a steady supply of developer time. When you understand the competition between proprietary and open source as a competition at the program level, it clears away a lot of distractions. Because now we can directly evaluate which strategy is the most adaptable strategy for software survival, the open source model or the proprietary model. A proprietary program can best be understood as a form of parasite. It resides in symbiosis with its host organism, the corporation that owns it, and it draws its sustenance exclusively from the developers provided by the corporation. The amount of sustenance provided to the program pretty directly correlates to the success of the corporation selling the program, though sales success may or may not correlate with the quality of the program. And when the corporation dies, the program usually dies too. If the corporation is subsumed by another corporation, the new host may continue to feed the program, starve it to death, or terminate it immediately in favor of some other program. When you think about it that way, it's easy to feel a little bit sorry for a proprietary program. It's very much at the mercy of its host. Its success or failure may have nothing to do with its intrinsic quality. It may have only a very small team of developers to love it, feed it, and carry it forward if it should die. In contrast to the sheltered monastic existence of proprietary software, the lifestyle of open source software is incredibly promiscuous. Any developer with a nice smile and a good patch is welcome to join the party. Open source programs can draw sustenance in the form of long-term, stable commitments from corporations who sell products or services around the software, or from devoted contractors who derive income from contracts for feature development or bug fixes. That's actually an in-joke for open source geospatial software. Frank is probably the most prolific independent contractor in the field. He works on 4 or 5 different really core libraries that are used across the whole ecosystem. Or from quick relationships with casual developers who just drop off a patch and run away. In contrast, proprietary programs are embedded within the institutional framework of a corporation. So it's much harder for them to form relationships with new sources of development. People can't just stroll in the door and add a new feature to Microsoft Word. The relationship between developer and proprietary software is formal, contractual, and exclusive. Open source programs can form relationships with multiple developers and multiple organizations simultaneously because open source is not trapped inside a single organization. The rules of participation are cultural, not contractual, and broad community participation is the whole point. Take the most successful open source example, Linux. The Linux software has gone from drawing development effort exclusively from a single finished graduate student to receiving the attentions of hundreds of fully funded developers in multiple Fortune 500 corporations. Even organizations that are in direct market competition, IBM and Oracle or Red Hat and Novell, they provide code to Linux. And so do thousands of other developers with institutional affiliations ranging from top secret government agencies to academia to individual developers whose only real affiliation is to their cat and their coffee vendor. In fact, kernel developer Greg Crow-Hartman did a study of the kernel source code in 2008, and he found that the #1 affiliation of kernel developers was unaffiliated. 70% of the Linux kernel, unaffiliated. Red Hat was #2 at 11%. The example of Linux shows that open source programs are not limited to feeding off pure open source companies. They can feed off any company or organization or individual that derives competitive advantage from using open source, like yourselves. One of the most perceptive observers and commentators on the interest of open source ideas in the marketplace is a fellow named Matt Assay. He's a blogger, he's very prolific. He writes pretty much every day, and every day he writes something that's worth reading. And he recently wrote, "We're all open source companies now, which means that none of us are." What he means is that every company in the marketplace is now deriving competitive advantage from open source one way or another. Oops. Even deeply, deeply proprietary companies. And IBM was once so proprietary that it made Microsoft look open by comparison, but in 2000, IBM was the first company to adopt a Linux strategy. They invest directly in the Linux kernel to ensure it runs on their CPUs and systems. They're a founder of the Eclipse project, and a number of their proprietary products are in fact built on that same project, like Rational. Oracle has purchased several open source companies over the last years, database companies like Innobase and SleepyCat, and this year they purchased Sun, which netted them several very well-known open source names, and they aren't just sitting on them. At Oracle Open World last week, Oracle's evil genius promised to invest more money in MySQL R&D than MySQL is currently spending. And even Microsoft, which practically invented the idea of proprietary shrink-wrap software back in the 70s, has an active open source strategy. They're hosting an open source code repository, Codeplex. They're a sponsor of the Apache Foundation. They invest in the development of Windows-compatible open source like IronPython, and now even PHP they're investing in. They've even recently contributed patches to the Linux kernel under the GNU GPL. In the geospatial industry as well, the momentum is more and more towards open source use. ESRI is the Microsoft of geospatial. They use the Google library, so does Google Earth, your own tool, FME, ERDASP, all proprietary products. They use that open source library. The PostGIS open source database that I work with has been adopted as more and more an industry standard database. People expect to see their data stored in open source databases, so the proprietary desktops are coming online and using PostGIS as a source of data. When even the proprietary companies are investing in open source, what does it mean anymore to be an open source company? Everybody's doing it. People like to talk about open source and the change from proprietary open source as an open source revolution. But revolutions are quick and turbulent affairs. Is it a revolution if it takes 25 years? I think that what we're experiencing is not an open source revolution, but an open source evolution. The progress is slow and incremental, but it's always in the same direction, month by month and year by year. We're just at the start of a transformation of the software market, where purchasers recognize they have an option to buy the whole product and get the software for free. And we're in the middle of a transformation in how we build software, moving very quickly from the closed corporate model where the source code is private to an open collaborative model where the source code is a commons. And it's that combination of those two trends that fills me personally with confidence, because those two trends are reinforcing each other. And that's why I can look at my mother-in-law in the eye and say, don't worry, it'll all work out. Because I'm on the side of history, on the ground floor of a growing market, riding a wave that is just picking up. And I hope so are all of you. Thanks very much. So short and sweet. Anyone got any questions? Yeah.
Can you tell us more about where your company does get its money from?
Yeah. OpenGeo as a company, to be fair, is very much a startup, but we don't get our money from traditional sources of venture capital. We are a social enterprise, which is to say that our goal is not to quintuple or multiply by a factor of 10 the original investment. We would like to just simply return the original investment. Our source of funding is a man named Mark Gordon in New York. He runs a hedge fund, and he's very, very interested in the field of urban planning. So he funds a nonprofit called the Open Planning Project, which does urban planning promotion in the United States primarily. And out of those efforts over the last 10 years have grown a series of software tools which are used in providing this urban planning. But they were built around open source, and it made sense to us to seed this market, to build an option so that people who could not afford to play the game in the proprietary field. And playing the game in geospatial in the proprietary field, I must say, is a very expensive proposition. And it locks out a lot of organizations who have valid social points to bring forward. So Mark wanted to keep funding this software in order to make sure that these organizations were able to have a voice as the conversation became more digital. So that's where our seed funding comes from. We do a fair amount of services work right now for larger government organizations, mostly doing implementations using the core of our open source software. So GeoServer, OpenLayers, GeoEXT, PostGIS are the products which we're wrapping up into an overall whole product. But starting 6 months ago and going forward, we're working to transition ourselves from being a services company that uses some of that money and our funders' money to build open source software to being a product company that can generate enough revenue selling this whole product, wrapped open source piece, to continue to fund the core development. Because what we really want to see is this core software continue to get better year over year without people having to do it as a side project. It really is important enough to be that people should be able to do it as their full-time job. Yeah.
So I'm sort of curious, you talked a lot about sort of the open source program as being some sort of organism and progressing in this sort of evolutionary progression.
Yeah.
I'm sort of curious though, is open source is also talked about, as being necessarily like a positive thing for society in general and the software
um, there are several axes along which programs win that evolutionary battle, and one of them is code quality, right? And I understand you set up your own internal processes of software development to try to force that competition towards code quality as much as possible. But of course, the other axes are things like, do the users care, and are the functionalities useful to large to large swaths of people, or at least to large swaths of organizations. And there's no guarantee that a software project that gets there first will be the one that survives, or the one that's written best will be the one that survives. It's the one that combines all those things. I think it is a good thing, because what's happening is the process of finding the best fit for society at a given moment has been decoupled from organizational imperatives like marketing or sales or so on. It's become very much a function of what actually does fit the needs of the largest number of people at the particular time. So yeah, I think it actually is a good thing. And I'm not really a free market guy necessarily, but I do. Yeah.
How do you think all this relates to people's source efforts? Like with the various things with open source, going the route that you suggested, giving the software for free over some
How do I think the commercialization works with open source? I think it only works to the better, because the people who need the commercialized product will pay for it. And if they won't, the company won't be able to sell it. Again, it's very much a law of the jungle kind of thing. And it doesn't appear, particularly when projects reach a certain size, it doesn't appear that the participation of even very ravenous competitive companies is a detriment to the development and continuation of the software. And examples like Linux or Eclipse and even MySQL now kind of speak to that. I think having companies involved is all to the good.
You mentioned the economists citing that it's going to be a blend of proprietary and open source.
Yeah.
Where do licenses come in? Do you have a feeling for which licenses are better for that sort of implementation?
So yeah, I'll put my oar into the religious argument, and I should do so by saying that initially my oar was on the other side of the canoe. When I entered into actually making an open source project myself with PostGIS, we licensed it GPL because we felt that anyone who wanted to play should bloody well be forced to come back into the pool with their code. Since then, having watched the evolution of a number of communities just in my little narrow geospatial space, communities like MapServer and Google OGR and so on, and having talked to the reams and reams of people who come and say, I'm interested in using your PostGIS software, but I've become convinced that the important ingredient is not that legalistic club to force people back in. It's the existence of a vibrant community. Where there is a strong, vibrant community, it doesn't matter if someone takes their toys and goes and plays by themselves, because it's the vibrant community that's going to outlast and outrun and outcompete the people playing with the toys by themselves. So I've really come to like, completely free licenses like BSD, where you just take it and go and do whatever you want. Actually, even preferably the amended BSD that doesn't include the attribution requirement. That's a little bit of license arcana, by the way, that I only learned a couple years ago. BSD in its original form is not compatible with the GPL, which means you can't put BSD code back into a GPL project, which can really slow you down, because it includes the attribution requirement, which is a restriction on use, which the GPL doesn't allow. So there's actually a thing called the modified BSD, which has stripped that out.
So, what do you think of companies, and I ask this perhaps specifically because I've seen Google doing a bit of this with some smaller open source projects, effectively just continuing developing something internally,
Yeah.
and basically, doing things like performing releases of externally available versions, but not really supporting the development of the community. So, people will be able to maybe use these tools.
Yeah. Open source in name, but not in practice. What do I think about it? I think it's profoundly counterproductive, but they pay the freight, so they get to make the choices. But it's kind of silly to license something open source and then not promote the growth of the one thing that really makes open source a vibrant, sort of future-proof alternative, which is the independent community.
There's an interesting tension there with the commercial companies, Red Duck being one example,
Yeah.
where they do sell the whole product.
Mhm.
And software is only one component of it at some I'm going to install this one and still expect support from it.
Yeah. To which Red Hat says, no, which is fair enough, because the point is that they're not.
Why don't you support our
Yeah,
latest
yeah,
version?
yeah,
It's
yeah,
a
yeah.
really nasty something.
It is nasty, but I mean, they're recognizing where the market lies, right? I mean, their market is not that front tail, and you know, they're happy to have those guys go off and support themselves, or not, as the case may be. But yeah, it's not where the money is, for sure. No, my main concern about Red Hat is not the Red Hat model in general is not that it doesn't work or make sense in the now. It's that it makes less sense in the future. Because step one for sort of big Fortune 500 companies was to recognize that they were taking a reaming using proprietary Unix and proprietary operating systems that they could do a lot better financially by replacing that with Linux. But because of their comfort levels, they chose to replace it with something that had that same vendor feel they were used to before. But a Fortune 500 company is big enough to employ its own experts, probably at a lower cost than what they're spending in licensing with Red Hat. And my concern is that over the next turn of the wheel, these big enterprise customers will realize that, you know, past a certain threshold of size, it makes sense for them to run this stuff in-house, and that they get far better performance of their support infrastructure doing it that way.
There's also a certain maturity in the open source products on which they're based.
Exactly.
At that point, the support model falls apart.
Yeah, and it might be the answer there, and this is something that we're very much cognizant of. The answer there is just to run faster, to keep ahead of what's really stable and infrastructural, and you put it in place and you forget about it. You know, turning on the electrical switch. You know, we don't run our own electrical companies. Stay far enough ahead of that you can stay relevant. And I think, again, that's a healthy thing, because proprietary companies have the option of locking their customers in and moving very slowly, basically as slow as their revenue cycle needs to be. Whereas we're going to be forced to run as fast as the customers force us to run.
I'm not sure I agree with your assessment of the Red Hat model in a way. As companies get really big,
Yeah.
because they can afford to have their own experts, I think experience shows that often as companies get really big, they decide to outsource more and more.
True.
To people to focus and be real experts.
Yeah.
So I don't know that it's a given that that's a fit.
It may well be that the enterprise size necessary to achieve that level of scale is so big that it's not really going to hurt Red Hat that much, right?
It's not a matter of the scale being necessary. It's also a question of where they choose to focus their resources, regardless of scale.
Yeah.
And what expenditure on infrastructure gives them the results they need at the best price point. Simply might not be the issue.
Yeah.
The case that they need to do that, and they'd rather put those resources together.
Yeah.
And if we're comfortable at lower cost, they can
It's true.
hire someone like that.
Companies like that might actually still continue to fall in that narrow little tail of crazy early adopters. And there's a scale thing, right? A company big enough to afford 2 Linux experts only has 2 Linux experts,
Exactly.
which means one bus could remove the Linux expertise in one go. Okay. Thanks for coming, guys. I appreciate it.